We're watching something extraordinary unfold right now, and most people have no idea what's really happening. The headlines scream about American carrier groups positioning near Iranian waters, about Tehran's fiery warnings, about inevitable collision courses. But here's what they're not telling you. This entire crisis might be manufactured theater, and the real question isn't whether war is unavoidable, it's who benefits from you believing it is. Because when you peel back the layers of this geopolitical chess match, when you look beyond the surface level saber rattling and examine the actual economic incentives, the energy pipelines at stake, and the dollar's desperate need for global relevance, a very different picture emerges. The military-industrial complex thrives on tension. Defense contractors see their stock prices soar with every escalation headline. And yet, both Washington and Tehran have consistent track records of stepping back from the brink at the last possible moment. So why does the narrative keep pushing us toward inevitability? That's the question nobody's asking, and it's the one that matters most. Let me start by saying something that might make you uncomfortable. We've been here before. Not just once or twice, but repeatedly over the past 2 decades. Every few years, like clockwork, the drumbeat of war with Iran begins again. The media cycles spin up, the think tanks publish their urgent policy papers, retired generals appear on cable news warning about imminent threats, and suddenly everyone's talking about red lines and points of no return. And yet, here we are. No war. Not yet, anyway. Which begs the question, if conflict with Iran has been inevitable for the last 20 years, why hasn't it happened? What's really going on beneath the surface of these manufactured crises? To understand what's happening right now, we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. The United States has been trying to regime change Iran since 1979. That's 45 years of sustained hostility, sanctions, covert operations, and periodic military threats. Think about that for a moment. 45 years. That's longer than most people's entire working careers. It's longer than the entire Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union from the end of World War II to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in all that time, through multiple administrations, both Democrat and Republican, through different geopolitical eras and shifting global alliances, the one constant has been Washington's obsession with Tehran. Why? What makes Iran so special, so threatening, so essential to American foreign policy calculations that we've maintained this fixation for nearly half a century? The standard answer you'll get from mainstream sources is that Iran sponsors terrorism, threatens Israel, opposes American interests in the Middle East, and is pursuing nuclear weapons. And sure, there's some truth in parts of that narrative. Iran does support Hezbollah and various militia groups throughout the region. Iran does have contentious relationships with Israel and Saudi Arabia. Iran did have a nuclear program, though the extent of its weaponization has always been debated and was supposedly constrained by the JCPOA before the Trump administration withdrew from that agreement. But here's the thing, none of those factors, individually or collectively, fully explain the intensity and persistence of American antagonism toward Iran. After all, Pakistan actually has nuclear weapons and has been caught proliferating nuclear technology. Saudi Arabia has been credibly linked to terrorism financing and was directly connected to 15 of the 19 hijackers on September 11th. Israel has an undeclared nuclear arsenal and has conducted numerous operations that violate international law. And yet, none of these countries face the kind of sustained economic warfare and military threats that Iran does. So clearly something else is at play here. The real answer, I would argue, has much more to do with Iran's independence than with any specific actions it takes. Iran is one of the few remaining countries of significant size and resources that operates outside the Western financial system, that sells its energy resources in currencies other than dollars, that maintains economic and political relationships that don't require Washington's approval. In the grand chess game of global hegemony, Iran represents something dangerous to the existing power structure, not because of what it might do militarily, but because of what it represents symbolically. It's a proof of concept that a nation can resist American pressure, can survive decades of sanctions, can maintain its sovereignty and develop its economy without bending the knee to Western financial institutions, and that's simply intolerable to the architects of the unipolar world order that's been in place since the end of the Cold War. Now, let's talk about what's actually happening right now. The United States has reportedly moved additional military assets into the region. We're hearing about carrier strike groups, about enhanced readiness levels, about coordination with regional allies. Iran, for its part, has issued warnings about responding to any aggression, has conducted military exercises, has made statements about its capabilities and resolve. On the surface, it looks like two countries on a collision course. But if you've been paying attention to these cycles over the years, you'll notice that this is essentially the same script we've seen played out multiple times before. There's a formulaic quality to these escalations that should make us suspicious. Here's how it typically works. First, there's an incident or a series of incidents. Maybe an attack on commercial shipping, maybe the seizure of vessels, maybe drone strikes or proxy attacks attributed to Iranian-backed forces. These incidents generate headlines and create a sense of crisis. Then American officials begin speaking about protecting vital interests, about not tolerating aggression, about keeping all options on the table. Military assets are moved into position, which is presented as a defensive necessity, but is also clearly a signal of potential offensive capability. Allied nations are consulted, support is rallied, and the diplomatic machinery begins framing the narrative in terms of international law and collective security. Meanwhile, Iran responds with its own signaling, military exercises, fiery rhetoric, demonstrations of missile capabilities. Both sides engage in a carefully choreographed dance of escalation that looks dangerous but is actually quite controlled. And then, almost invariably, the crisis de-escalates. Sometimes there's a face-saving diplomatic breakthrough. Sometimes attention simply shifts to a different crisis somewhere else in the world. Sometimes there's a minor military exchange that allows both sides to claim they've defended their interests without triggering an actual war. The point is, the system seems designed to create the appearance of imminent conflict without actually following through, which raises an important question. If nobody actually wants a war, why do we keep going through this ritual? The answer, I believe, is that the tension itself serves multiple purposes. For the military-industrial complex, each crisis justifies massive defense expenditures, weapons sales to regional allies, and the maintenance of a large forward-deployed military presence. Every time there's a threat of war with Iran, countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE open their checkbooks and purchase billions of dollars worth of American weapons systems. Defense contractors see their quarterly earnings jump, military budgets get approved without much debate, the whole apparatus of the security state expands a little bit more. So from that perspective, the perpetual crisis is actually ideal. It's profitable without being catastrophically expensive the way an actual war would be. For politicians, these crises provide opportunities to appear strong, to rally domestic support, to distract from economic problems or political scandals at home. Nothing unites a fractured polity quite like an external threat. When American politicians want to look decisive and presidential, they often turn to foreign policy and military posturing because it's an area where they face less domestic opposition and can act with relatively few constraints. The forever crisis with Iran has become a reliable tool in the political toolbox, something that can be pulled out whenever needed to change the conversation or boost approval ratings. For the media, these tensions generate clicks, views, and ratings. Fear sells, conflict sells. The possibility of war is an irresistible story that drives engagement and advertising revenue. So the media has every incentive to amplify the crisis narrative, to bring on guests who predict dire outcomes, to use dramatic language and alarming graphics. Even if journalists individually might be trying to report accurately, the structural incentives of the media business push towards sensationalism and worst-case scenarios. And for the broader geopolitical establishment, the think tanks, the foreign policy journals, the network of experts and analysts who make their living opining on these matters, the Iran crisis provides endless opportunities for papers, conferences, consulting contracts, and media appearances. Entire careers have been built on Iran expertise. Whole organizations exist primarily to advocate for more aggressive policies toward Tehran. There's a vast institutional infrastructure that has a vested interest in maintaining the perception that Iran represents an ongoing, serious threat that requires constant attention and resources. Now, I'm not saying that there are no real tensions or that all of this is completely fabricated. Obviously, the United States and Iran have genuine conflicts of interest. Obviously, there are hardliners in both countries who would welcome a military confrontation. Obviously, accidents can happen and miscalculations can lead to unintended escalations. The danger is real enough. But what I am saying is that the inevitability is manufactured. The sense that we're on an unstoppable path to war is a narrative choice, not an objective reality. And understanding that distinction is crucial because it affects how we think about what's possible and what should be done. Consider the actual strategic calculus from both sides. Does the United States really want a full-scale war with Iran? Look at the track record of recent American military interventions. Iraq turned into a catastrophic quagmire that cost trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives while destabilizing the entire region and creating the conditions for ISIS to emerge. Afghanistan ended in humiliating withdrawal after 20 years of occupation that accomplished essentially nothing. Libya descended into chaos and became a haven for extremists. Syria remains a complicated mess where multiple powers vie for influence. Knowing all of this, knowing the immense costs and limited benefits of these interventions, would American military and political leaders really want to open a new front with a country that's larger, more populous, more technologically advanced, and more strategically positioned than any of those previous targets? A country that could shut down the Strait of Hormuz and send oil prices through the roof, triggering a global economic crisis? A country that has significant missile capabilities and could strike American bases and allied nations throughout the region? A country that has proven remarkably resilient and capable of asymmetric warfare? The honest answer is that the costs of such a war would be enormous and the benefits highly uncertain. Yes, there are factions within the American establishment that advocate for military action against Iran, and yes, there are scenarios where conflict could happen. But the actual decision makers, the people who would have to prosecute such a war and deal with its consequences, have consistently pulled back from that brink when push comes to shove. Every American president in recent memory has ultimately chosen not to start a war with Iran, despite having opportunities and pressures to do so. That pattern tells you something important about the real calculations being made behind closed doors. Similarly, does Iran actually want a war with the United States? Iran's leadership may be many things, but they're not suicidal. They understand perfectly well that they cannot win a conventional military conflict with the world's most powerful military. Their entire strategy for the past 4 decades has been based on survival through deterrence, through asymmetric capabilities, through building regional influence via proxy forces. They've invested heavily in missile technology and cyber capabilities specifically because those offer ways to impose costs on potential adversaries without requiring them to match American military power plane for plane or ship for ship. Iranian strategy is fundamentally defensive. It's about making any attack on Iran too costly to be worthwhile, not about conquering territory or projecting power globally. Yes, Iran pushes back against American pressure. Yes, it supports forces throughout the region that oppose American interests. But all of this is about creating strategic depth and deterrence, not about seeking confrontation for its own sake. So if neither side actually wants a war, why does it keep looking like we're headed toward one? Part of the answer is that both sides benefit from a degree of tension. For Iran, external threats help the regime maintain internal cohesion and justify its security apparatus. For the United States, the Iran threat justifies military presence in the region and weapons sales to allies. But there's a deeper dynamic at play here, one that has to do with the changing nature of global power and the desperation of a declining hegemon. The United States is not the unquestioned superpower it was in the aftermath of the Cold War. That unipolar moment has passed. China has emerged as a peer competitor economically and increasingly militarily. Russia has reasserted itself as a major player, particularly in the Middle East and Europe. Regional powers like Iran, Turkey, and even Saudi Arabia are pursuing more independent foreign policies. The dollar's dominance as the global reserve currency is being gradually eroded by alternative payment systems and bilateral trade agreements. American credibility has been damaged by failed interventions, broken promises, and inconsistent policies. The whole architecture of American global hegemony is under strain in ways it hasn't been since the 1970s. In this context, the obsession with Iran starts to make more sense. It's not really about Iran specifically. It's about demonstrating that the United States still has the power to coerce sovereign nations into compliance. It's about showing that there are consequences for independence, for resistance to American dictates. Iran has become almost a symbolic battlefield in the larger struggle over what kind of international order will exist in the 21st century. Will it be one where Washington makes the rules and everyone else follows them? Or will it be a more multipolar world where different power centers coexist and compete? The treatment of Iran sends a message to every other mid-sized power about what happens if you choose independence over alignment. But here's the problem with this approach. It's not working. Decades of sanctions haven't brought Iran to its knees. They've certainly hurt the Iranian economy and caused real suffering for ordinary Iranians, but they haven't achieved regime change or fundamental policy shifts. If anything, the pressure has pushed Iran to become more self-reliant, to develop domestic capabilities, to strengthen ties with countries like China and Russia that are also outside the Western-dominated system. Every year that Iran survives despite maximum pressure is a demonstration that American coercive power has limits. Every year that this standoff continues is another year that other countries observe and draw conclusions about whether they need to defer to Washington's preferences. This is why I think the current tensions, as alarming as they might appear, are unlikely to result in a full-scale war. The costs are too high, the benefits too uncertain, and the risks of failure too great. What we're witnessing is more likely another round of the same ritualized confrontation we've seen before, one designed to serve various institutional interests and project an image of strength, but ultimately calibrated to stop short of actual warfare. That doesn't mean there's no danger. Accidents happen, miscommunications happen, proxy conflicts can spiral out of control. A missile strike could hit the wrong target or kill the wrong people and create pressure for retaliation that becomes hard to resist. So I'm not saying we should be complacent or that the risks are trivial. What I am saying is that we should be skeptical of narratives that present war as inevitable or necessary. We should ask who benefits from that narrative and what interests are served by keeping tensions high. We should remember that the same voices that told us Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and that Libya would be a quick humanitarian intervention are now telling us that confrontation with Iran cannot be avoided. We should learn from history instead of being condemned to repeat it. And most importantly, we should recognize that the path to war is always a choice, not a destiny. There are always alternatives, always diplomatic options, always possibilities for de-escalation if there's genuine will to pursue them. The question is whether that will exists, or whether too many powerful interests prefer the profitable tension to the uncertain peace.